Joining us for today's conversation, he is a gentleman who has previously run for Secretary of State, and he is your Republican candidate for State Auditor. We have Anthony Amore joining us. Do you prefer Anthony or Tony?
My dad was Tony, so I've always gone by Anthony.
Excellent, excellent. So, right out of the gate, tell us a little bit about yourself and why did you decide to run for this particular seat?
Well, thank you for having me, and thanks for asking. Again, my name's Anthony Amore. I'm a candidate for state auditor. I live in Winchester. I have two grown daughters, both currently pursuing their master's degrees. I decided to run for state auditor because I really feel like it's important to be part of helping people. I've always been involved in public service. So, and I consider my current job, I work at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, and I consider that public service. This museum was left to the public for its enjoyment and education forever. And I look for paintings, these stolen masterpieces that belong to the public. And before I worked at the Gardner Museum, I worked for the Department of Homeland Security for 15 years. Well, I should say agencies that are now part of Homeland Security. So I worked for the Immigration Service, then FAA Security, and those were all swallowed up by DHS after the events of 9/11. I've always been service oriented. And when I saw that there was an open seat for auditor this year, that the job really is all about transparency, and it allows me to use my investigative skills that I've honed for over 3 decades. I felt it was a really good fit, and it's an exciting opportunity for me. So I decided to run. It's this from all the people you've interviewed over the years. Running for office is a grind. And Commonwealth Magazine pointed out yesterday, I'm the one person this year who has a full-time job while he runs. So it's a lot of work, but I think it's worth it because the opportunity to be a public servant, I view as an honor. So those are my reasons for choosing this office.
Does the general public understand what the job of the state auditor does? What is all entailed with the position?
Such an important question. The answer is no, and I mean by a wide margin. Anytime I go speak to people, whether it's individuals or big groups, and I talk about the office, the first question is, what is the auditor? In fact, I'll do community groups, and it'll be titled like Auditor 101, and I have to explain the office, which is a unique thing for a politician. But that's good. It's good for people to be interested and want to know. And part of being auditor is educating the public, right? So you go into the job and you root out waste, fraud, and abuse, and you write these reports. Part 2 is educating the public about what you found. So I explain to people that the state auditor is the chief accountability officer for the state. And that is an important title. And it doesn't mean that state agencies are accountable to the office. They're accountable to the people. So the state auditor is a conduit of information gathered while trying to root out waste, fraud, and abuse, and taking this information and informing the public. And the reason that's important is because the best way that your audience can be effective members of their community is to pay attention to what the auditor finds and hold their state representatives accountable.
You recently received a key endorsement from a gentleman named Andy Card, well known. How important is the recognition of an individual like this, and how long of a way does it go to voters who recognize who Andy Card is?
Well, it is so important to me personally. The most formative part of my life, the pivotal moment, was 9/11 for me and for many people of my generation. And but particularly for me, because I worked in aviation security at Logan Airport, and then I was part of the team, this 3-member team that led the rebuild of security at Logan Airport right after 9/11. And to know that Andy Card, Secretary Card, the chief of staff to George Bush, the man who whispered in his ear and told him about the attack, to know that he knew who I was in the White House is so gratifying. I didn't know this until now, 20 years later. And to know that, we were working these 16 or 18-hour days, 7 days a week, that somebody in the highest level of power recognize this. It's gratifying. Um, I've always admired uh, Andrew Card. I've always thought of him as the best example of what government should be, a man of integrity, a man who's focused on public service, and a man who, despite years in politics, has always avoided the acrimony between parties. So his esteem, lending his esteem to my campaign meant the world to me.
Why is the state auditor's office important or synonymous with transparency, especially when it comes to certain state and government agencies?
Well, the auditor is responsible for auditing all 209 state agencies every 3 years. And, for the last 80 years, 80, the office has been held by a Democrat. And many people don't know what the auditor is because there's not a lot of vested interest in finding problems and telling the public when you're part of a one-party system. I envision the auditor as truly transparent, a person who gathers information. His large team of auditors writes exhaustive reports, but it doesn't end there. That's what's happening now. They end there. But the transparency part is the auditor takes these reports and brings them to the public very aggressively. Your audience doesn't know a lot about the auditor because the auditor for decades hasn't done this. I will. That's why I think transparency is so important to the position. My opponent in this race voted against transparency when she was a legislator in 2013, 2015, and 2017. She voted against making state house committee votes public. She keeps them in private, and the public doesn't like that. They want to know where their representatives stand. So I'm really the transparency candidate in this race.
I think with certain political races, governor, state rep, state senator, there are a litany of issues that you can tie to various campaigns. Do you feel that there are some key issues that the voter, before they go and vote on November 8th, needs to know?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. You know, the first thing I try to tell people when I speak to them is that our current auditor, who is required to audit 100% of state agencies, only audits about 70%. So voters should know that in our current setup, the auditor is not auditing 30% of your state government. 30% is going without a watchdog monitoring their spending of your tax dollars, any waste, fraud, or abuse that's going on in those offices, any corruption that's going on in those offices. It's not happening. And you should be very alarmed about that. And my opponent has been endorsed by this auditor who's not completing her mandate. I think people should demand that the auditor, the watchdog, audit itself and make sure you're doing your job too. It's really an ugly part of government when there's just this failure at a major level. So the main thing I want people to know, the issue they should know is they have the opportunity with me to elect an auditor who's done this work. I've done it for 30 years and I've led a big organization for many years. My opponent has never done a single audit and has never led anything. And those are important things. And that's a real major issue in this, Kevin, because on day one, you need someone who can do the job. And I'm the only candidate who's done it. I'm the clear choice when it comes to experience.
If you're just tuning into our program, we are privileged to be speaking with Anthony Amore. He is a candidate for state auditor. It's just, I can't believe it, a few weeks away until the general election on November 8th. Make sure you get out and vote. If you are elected, are there changes that you'd like to make to this particular office or any restructuring you would like to do?
Absolutely. So the first thing we'll do, if I'm elected, before I even take office, during the transition period, I will establish a team that will audit the auditor's office and find out why it's coming short in its mandate. And on day one, we'll get to work fixing that. Now, part of the reason that we know is that the auditor's office is vastly underfunded, but the Democrats that have held the office have never worked to increase its funding. So I'll give you an example. Pennsylvania and Illinois are two states that have the same size state budget as we do. Their auditors are budgeted at $42 million per year in each state. Ours is budgeted at 21, half, because nobody on Beacon Hill wants somebody to look into the books. I will work hard to get that budget increased. My opponent has been in the legislature for 10 years. She's done nothing to increase the budget. She pointed out to me in a debate recently that she voted once to increase the budget by $500,000, which is a drop in the ocean. Now that she's running for office, she talks about the need to increase the budget. Well, it's too little, too late. I'm the person that's pointed this out. She's followed my lead in making this an issue. I will work really hard to make this a robust auditor's office that people will be proud of. And Kevin, I always say, audiences might not know right now what the auditor does, but when my time is over, they certainly will.
What would you try to increase the budget to? I mean, what is it right now, and what would you look to increase it to?
Well, it's at 21 million now. States that are our size are at 42 million. So I would work really hard to push the legislature to increase the budget to a level that's consummate with what other states have. But also we need to get the office in order. I've done this sort of work before. I built the compliance and enforcement program for the Transportation Security Administration of Boston. And my work was so effective in building this that I was sent to Washington to help build it out for the rest of the country. I know how to do this. My opponent does not. And that's an important factor that voters should remember.
So I would ask this, we're talking about legislature, and let's kind of dovetail our next question into that. Do you believe that the state auditor should also be involved in certain pieces of legislation, whether it's authoring it or seeking assistance from legislators to craft certain legislation?
I believe that the auditor should have an anti-waste program that I would implement. And that anti-waste program would look at pending legislation and determine what type of impact it would have on the state budget and if it will lead to waste, fraud, and abuse. So I think that the auditor's office should play a key role in looking at coming legislation. For example, recently, your audience knows that Section 62F kicked in, which means we're going to get a tax rebate. We overpaid by $2.94 billion, and that money needs to go back to taxpayers. It was my campaign that pushed to make this known, that pushed to make the auditor sign off on it early. And we worked with Governor Baker's office to push for rebates, not tax credits. So it's that sort of aggressive communication to the public to hold people's feet to the fire on Beacon Hill that voters can expect from me.
So as we're getting ready to close out our conversation, and again, we want to thank you, Anthony, for joining us. Is there something I haven't asked you, but you feel we shouldn't leave our conversation without talking about it?
Yes, and thank you for that. You mentioned that I've been endorsed by former White House Chief of Staff Andy Card. In modern history, no one has been a chief of staff to the president for a longer time. He's a serious person. But I think people should also know that I'm the only statewide candidate endorsed by Governor Baker, who is the most popular governor in the country for a reason. I'm endorsed by Lieutenant Governor Karen Polito, who is incredibly popular and has traveled to every town and city in the state and knows what the state needs. I'm endorsed by Governor Bill Weld, who people trust for his fiscal management and his prudence. And I'm endorsed by former Governor James Swift, who knows that I'm the sort of person that will take this independent, objective view on government. I'm endorsed by many other people that your audience trusts, like Mayor Shauna O'Connell, who knows I can do this work, like Mary Connaughton, an unbelievable candidate for auditor, and many other people. And I want people to know they can have confidence in me when they hear the names Baker and Polito and Weld and Swift and Card, and know that that's the serious sort of moderate Republican who can bring really effective government to Beacon Hill. Checks and balances are so important, and I'm the guy for them.
And if I'm correct, I think that the governor has not necessarily endorsed many candidates, especially when it comes to constitutional offices, folks who are running for those offices. How does that feel?
I'm the only one, and it feels like an incredible honor because I admire Governor Baker. I count him as a friend and have for a while, but I know that his stamp of approval on my candidacy means a lot, not just to me personally, but to the voters. They trust Governor Baker, and I ask them to trust him by voting for me come November 8th, or now with your early ballots.
So I'll throw one last question out at you. Well, it's one of two, and that is, if you're elected on November 8th, what would you say early on would be your mission statement for your office?
My mission statement would be to root out waste, fraud, and abuse, to make government accountable to the people in a truly transparent fashion, and to change the face of the auditor's office to be a true resource for the taxpayers of Massachusetts.
Now, folks want to find out more about your campaign. How can they do that?
Well, I welcome them to check me out on any social media platform, but go to my website, and that's an easy way to get to those. It's Amore, Amore, Amore2022.com.
Now, I want to thank you for joining us on this conversation, and if you are successful, I would love to have you on a regular basis, as it needs, as the need is there, especially if you do have a report that's coming out that needs a little, especially here on the South Shore, for folks to hear about it.
I'm so glad you said that, because that's an important part of my platform. My goal, if elected, is to communicate to the public exactly through programs like yours, by going to local programs, not just throwing press releases at the Boston Globe, but going to community radio, community television, community groups, and speaking directly to the people unfiltered. That is the key to the success of this office. So if I'm elected, you can count on hearing from me very often, as much as you'll have me.
He is Anthony Amore, candidate for state auditor. He has been our guest.